Welcome to the 40th Annual Greater Lafayette Holocaust Remembrance Conference. I am Sarah Powley, Chair of the Holocaust Remembrance Committee. We are 20 individuals, all volunteers in the Greater Lafayette community, who are dedicated to three goals: to honor the survivors and the victims of the Holocaust, to educate the community about the Holocaust, and to combat discrimination and social injustice in all of its forms today. We are appreciative of our sponsors and the individual donors who have made this program possible today. Our virtual discussion with Sam Wachs and his wife Noga was recorded a few weeks ago in Netanya, Israel. Following the presentation, there will be a live QA with Sam and Noga that will be facilitated by Professor Rebecca Klein-Pasheva. She is a member of the Department of History and the director of the Human Rights Program at Purdue University. Again, thank you for joining us. We are honored that on this day, Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day around the world, that Sam and Noga Wachs will be speaking to us from their home in Israel. Thank you.
Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'm addressing you from my home in Netanya, Israel, 200 meters from the beach, which is exactly the place that I like to be in. I made my home in Israel since 1991, when I came here as a recent widower with my two sons. Then I met my wife Noga, and we got married, and we get together twice a month in normal times, not now because we have the corona situation. But I'm proud to show you that I have a big family. This is my family, children and grandchildren. This is one of my youngest grandchild. These are my two boys. A short time after we arrived in Israel, and I feel that I belong to this place. I have been received here with open arms, and this is my home. My home is not located in the greatest of neighborhoods, but it's still my home. And like every other home, it has its leaks and it has its cracks. It's not perfect. I hope that future generations will be able to shape it up a little bit more. Now you got my present, now I go over to my past. And I was born in a little village called Zalesczyki, which used to be in Poland, and now it belongs to Ukraine. The village is located on the river Dniester, which in those days was the limit, the frontier between Poland and Romania. And there was a bridge, as you can see here, where I'm pointing the pointer across the Dniester, going from Poland to Romania. And this is very important to remember. Here you can see the marketplace. This was photographed in 1935, which is a short while before the war erupted. And there is a meaning to this picture as well. So you have to remember this picture and you have to remember this bridge. They both are significant in my history. I was born on the 6th of October in 1938. And my parents were Esther Zandberg and Joseph Reisenberg. And one of my mother's sisters, my Aunt Bronya, which played a key role in my life, and she owned a hotel that was called Vita. Vita is in Latin, the meaning is life. It was a small hotel, and this is an extract from the phone book at that time. And that is very important to show that she owned a hotel and she was an excellent cook. On the left, this is my grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side. And at the time I was born, my grandfather already passed away, and that's why I carried his name. And this is my mother and myself, and this is my grandfather on the side of my father. In 1939, the Russians invaded Poland because of the partition treaty with Nazi Germany that split Poland in two. So we belong to the sector that was occupied by the Russians. And in 1941, 2 years later, the Germans broke that treaty and they invaded the whole of Poland in their way into Russia. So we became under the rule of the Germans. So here comes the point of the bridge. My question is, the Jews had 2 years to find safety, either going into depth into Russia or crossing that bridge into Romania. Why didn't they do it? I don't have an answer to that. On the left, you have a picture of the yellow star, a star that unfortunately I carry inside me through all my life. That's how I was branded since birth, and that's how I feel. This is my Aunt Bronya in her 20s. This is the ID of my Uncle David, her husband, that was a pharmacist. And this is the picture of their only son, who at that time was age 20. The Germans took about 3-4 months to get organized after their invasion. And when they occupied Zalesczyki, they asked all the Jews to concentrate in that marketplace that was very big, and most of the Jews did so. At that time, there were about 2,400 Jews in Zalesczyki. 800 of them went to that reunion place because they were promised work permits. The Nazis loaded them into trucks, took them to a deserted Polish army camp, and machine gunned them. Every single one of them, and among them was also my father. The Jews that went into hiding were ordered to go to Kluster, which is another town, 24 kilometers from there. This is shown on this slide. And of course, they weren't trucked, they weren't carried, they had to go by foot. It's a 5-hour trek. And they got into the Kluster ghetto. And in this way, Zalesczyki was cleaned of Jews and became Judenrein, which means clean, a place clean of Jews. Then, after a little while, the Kluster ghetto had to be closed down. So my Aunt Bronya, with her son and her husband, got work permits and went to a work camp called Kozhagora. And my mother took me into hiding with a farmer. In 1943, in October 1943, we were denounced by another Jew that got caught by the Ukrainian, and the Ukrainian came into our hiding place and shot my mother in front of my eyes. At dusk, when the farmer's wife got back to the house, she found me wandering around at the age of 5, crying and not knowing what to do. So she put me in a sack and carried me to the labor camp where my Aunt Bronya was working. And as I said at the beginning, since my Aunt Bronya was a very good cook. She was the personal cook of the Nazi commander of the camp, which was a German officer. This was a short time after her own son, Bronya's son, was killed by the Ukrainians. So, in all my life, I tried to make sure that I can return to her in some way, in some measure, her loss by trying to be the best son that I knew how to. In this slide, this is not a real slide, what happened to me, but it just shows you that I was the only child in that camp. It was forbidden to have children in the working camp. But since my Aunt Bronya was the commander's cook, he let her have me with her. And Lucia Gendelman, which was a young girl at that time, aged around 20, which I met in Israel many, many years later when I emigrated to here. She told me this story. I didn't remember it, but she told me that when I was in the camp and I saw the commander, I looked him straight in the eyes, which nobody else dared to do, and I asked him, since you are such a powerful person, how come you don't have children of your own so I could play with them? So that's the story that Lucia told me many years later. In the back of the screen, you can see sort of bunks where we slept in the barracks, and Ukrainians kept raiding the camp almost every night and shooting at random inside the barracks. And of course, there were dead, and people took the dead out. And in the following morning, when I would go out of the barrack, I would see all those corpses at the entrance to the barracks. I don't know such a sight, what can it do to a mind of a boy of 5 years? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. My stay in the camp is documented, but the memorial book of Kluster, which can be obtained in the internet, I guess. This is where my son Juan got it from, and here is highlighted the story about me. Right. No. On the left, you can see many years later when I met Lucia. Here's Lucia and myself. When the labor camp was closed down, we went back to a labor camp near Kloster. And in 1944, my uncle David took his own life. He was a pharmacist. He always carried drugs with him, poison, and he poisoned himself because he couldn't stand getting on with life after the loss of his son. We were liberated a few months after he took his life. We were liberated by the Russians and kept going with the troops back and forth according to the front lines. And after the war, we settled in the area. Well, actually, we wandered from town to town in the same area of Zalesczyki, trying to get contact with other Jews that also remained. And in that condition, where we didn't have a roof over our heads, neither food nor money, we seek help each one from the other. So there was a lot of solidarity there. And on the center, you see a Primus stove, and that's where my Aunt Bronya cooked the meals that she later sold from door to door to earn some living and keep us going. This is 1946 with a friend. We used to go to the movies together, and we could get into the movie house without paying because we went at noon when the place was empty. So they would let us in, and we would watch Soviet movies, and that's how I learned to speak Russian, and I understood a bit of Ukrainian, and the main language was Polish. Simultaneously, Bronya started corresponding with her relatives that lived at the time in Argentina. There were 3 sisters-in-law in Buenos Aires. And they paid us tickets. At that time, we traveled by vessel. And on the map, on a plane, it's 8 hours trip. By boat, it took us 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Bronya taught me to speak Yiddish because her sisters-in-law didn't understand Polish, and we didn't want to, we wanted to accommodate them and didn't want to speak on a language that they wouldn't understand. We only had papers for Montevideo in Uruguay because at that time, under Perón, Argentina wasn't too keen to receive Jews. And as you probably know, they were very keen on receiving Nazis that bought Argentinian passports and had a free entrance to Argentina, but not so much about Jews. So we went to Montevideo, this is on your right frame, and by boat, it's a very short distance. We came to Buenos Aires afterwards, illegally, and then after a short time, there was a pardon, and we became residence. I kept on being a permanent resident and didn't got Argentine citizen until the age of 24, for the simple reason that I didn't want to get drafted into the army. So being a resident, I didn't have to serve. And so I chose to be a temporary resident until that time. We got into Buenos Aires around April, which is after the beginning of the term, and I didn't know anything about the language. So Bronya brought a student that by using comics taught me how to speak Spanish. I'm still amazed how a small child, his mind is so open that he can grasp knowledge in a very short time. So when on the next school year, I could start on regular schooling. Remember that I was already 9 years old and I still didn't know how to read and write. So I had a backlog of 3 years in my schooling. And therefore, I jumped the 6th grade in basic school and grade school, and I jumped 2 years out of 5 in high school. So when I entered university, I was already up to standard with all the rest of the students. I didn't keep track of the slides, so this is our Polish passport, and this is Bronya and myself when we just arrived in Buenos Aires, and we stayed at the house of Aunt Rosa and Uncle Itzik. Aunt Rosa was the sister-in-law of Bronya, and we stayed there for a very long time. But we didn't have any money, and our relatives weren't in a very high position either. So Bronya sought coveralls during the evening. She took over the cooking to compensate in some way for the inconvenience that we were causing Aunt Raisin and Uncle Itzik and their only daughter, Dora. So Bronya sought coveralls in the evenings until the early hours in the morning, and I tried to sleep with the noise of the Zinger sewing machine. In parallel to the grade school and the high school, I also went in the evenings to the Hebrew teacher seminar in order to be able to get a job at the end of my studies and help the economy of Bologna and myself. So 1 year after I entered university, I started teaching in Hebrew. This is myself in Hebrew grade school. In 1960, at the beginning of 1963, I completed my 6 years of engineering. Now, since I'm not looking at my notes, I have to jump here backwards again and to tell you a story. When I was 13 years old, which for the Jews is a very important age. It's the bar mitzvah. My aunt Rachel from South Africa, which Bologna located, she was the daughter of a brother of my grandfather on the side of my father. Rachel, when she heard that we were saved and alive, she was childless. So she wrote to Bologna proposing to her to adopt me and take me to South Africa. They were in a very good economic position. And Bologna, who was always fair with me, asked me. By then I was around 10 years old. She asked me, do you want to go to South Africa? They are in a very good position. They will treat you well, and you will grow up around well. And I said, by no way, I'll stick to you. So going back in my story, when I was 13 years old, Rachel asked me what I would like to have as a present. And I said that I would like to have the biggest Meccano rector set that was in the market at that time. That was number 6. And she answered, we couldn't get number 6, that we got number 5. So I'm sending this with my relative, Gertie Hirschman, that's on a cruise to Buenos Aires with her husband, Chami. And we are still corresponding regularly up to this day with their son, Jacob, which I love very much. So I got my erector set. Why did I want an erector set? Apparently, that was my strong will to build after all the destruction that I saw in my childhood. Already at that time, I knew that I wanted to be an engineer. And in 1962, I completed my 6-year studies to become an electromechanical engineer. And then in 1964, actually, I met my first wife, Nora, and which you can see at my wedding in 1965. We had our first child in 1967, and we named him David Joseph. David for Bronya's husband, Joseph for my father. And that was a symbol. That boy got the creating, well, early death syndrome and passed on 2 months after he was born. So I don't know, I felt that my father died twice, and it wasn't easy, neither for me nor for Nora, and it impacted our marriage, and I still wonder how that impacted her health. And I was already working in General Electric as a field engineer when I got married. I kept on working. In 1967, I didn't feel that I was making any progress in my career. So there was an opening to study railway engineering at the university, a 2 years post-grad course that would enable me to get a job with the Argentine railways. So I resigned Gene and went on to that program, but well, I didn't mention that Nora was a doctor of medicine, an MD. So she already had her practice. And when I finished the course, there was a revolution, one of many in Argentina. The army took over and they ignored the agreements. So they offered me a job in a very distant province. So I had to resign there because my wife was having her practice in Buenos Aires. So I started looking for another job, and I got a job as maintenance manager in a zipper factory. Then 2 years later, in 1979, our first or second son, Fernando, was born. And after very many efforts, and we started building again our family. After 3 years' time, I resigned from the zipper factory and got back to General Electric. This is my wife, and my third son was born in 1981. And he's the one that's living in the United States now. And Juan, who is my third son, thought that this would be a good picture of me smoking my pipe and feeding him a bottle. So I smoked for like 30 years. This is my wife. She passed away. I have to track back again. In 1972, I got sent by GE to the US for a 4-month training. And I stayed in the US, mainly in Schenectady, upstate New York. And all of a sudden, I got a call from Argentina to come back. And when I came back, Nora told me that she was diagnosed breast cancer and had her breast removed and undertook radiation. The prognosis was that her life expectancy was about 10 years. Well, due to her strong will, she did that until 1988. At that time, I was already a turbine engineer. You saw a picture of that. Here it is me as a turbine engineer, field engineer. And she passed away in 1988. At that time, I was working in Maracaibo, Venezuela. I got another phone call, rushed back home, and could see her before she passed away a few days later. So now I was in a situation when I was about 50 years old with 2 boys, which I had to take care of. And we started discussing what we wanted to do. And the 3 of us decided that we wanted to move over to Israel. But Juan was still in high school, so we have to wait for 2 years until he finished his high school. And then we did the paperwork to come to Israel, which took a while because 1990, the Gulf War broke up and we couldn't fly. And then when that was finished in 1991, we came to Israel and were received by open arms. At that time, on the right bottom, this is my immigrant ID. Then here it shows how immigrants are received in Israel. This is not our flight. This is an allied flight. And this is our final wandering, my final wandering from Buenos Aires to Israel. In 1995, I met my second wife, Noga. This is a picture of our wedding, 1996. And now we became a family with 5 children. This is Regev, this is Fernando, this is David, this is Juan, and this is Amikam. So I was lucky. I got my wife, Noga, and she gave my boys a warm home, a home that we built, and we are very happy with it. Now we have also 5 grandchildren. Here is a picture of the present of the family on the Shabbat dinner, our children and grandchildren. This is Netanya, a town that I like very much. And what's in the future? During all my travels as a field engineer, in 1994, I had to install a turbine in the city of Linz in Austria. There is a concentration camp very close to Linz, which is called Mauthausen. At that time, there was no GPS that could guide me. So I was driving, and I decided on a weekend to drive over to Mauthausen. When I was very close to the place, I started asking directions from passers-by. Nobody seemed to know the place. So my conclusion is that anti-Semitism is still very much alive and kicking. And we have to do something about it. This is a postcard exhibited in the Museum of Mauthausen, and the title of the postcard is A Family. It's a very sad one. As opposed to the family that I could rebuild with the help of my dear Wachs. Already in Israel, I learned about the Evian conference in 1938, before the war even started. This is on the left, taken from Wikipedia. You can find it if you Google it. It says that 33 nations convened in that conference, and the purpose of the conference was that Hitler wanted to have other countries take over his Jews. He wanted to get rid of the Jews of Germany and Austria. And he even said that he was ready to pay a first-class ticket to any Jew that any country would accept. Guess what? No country volunteered out of 32. Only the Dominican Republic took over a quota of 100,000 Jews. Well, I don't have to explain the slide on the right. You all probably know it. Now I want to concentrate on the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. And I would strongly recommend these three books. Phone Calls from Arthur Miller. This is his only novel, I think, because he was mainly a playwright. It talks about anti-Semitism in the United States, came out in 1945, just after the Second War. Second book is Alone in Berlin from Hans Fallada. I recommend it strongly. It doesn't say anything about anti-Semitism, well, very little, but it talks about a couple of Germans that lost her son in the Stalingrad front and got very upset against the Nazi regime and started their own sole campaign against Nazis. It's an extraordinary book. I would recommend it strongly. The third book is called Wave, and I would say that this book should be made compulsory reading in every school, in every place in the world. This is how young people get influenced and, has been said through ages. It has been talked about Gog or Magog, the God of good and the God of evil, and the fight between them. And this is also our internal fight of every human being between the good and the bad. And we are in constant fight. And this is how anti-Semitism gets to people. So, and my message to everyone is be strong defending democracy, because democracy is the only system that makes us accept the other, tolerate the other, give the other equal rights and rights of minorities. There is a famous saying by a prominent Lutheran German pastor that said, first they came from the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for. So, be strong protecting democracy. And I think the group that sponsored my talk to you, the GLHRC, is doing a fantastic job. And I'm full of respect to every one of its members that does a job in his free time to strive for acceptance and tolerance and receiving the minorities. I have to thank you all for your attention and for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. And I hope I'll be able to answer your question. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this special discussion with Sam Wachs at this year's 40th Annual Greater Lafayette Holocaust Remembrance Conference. My name is Rebecca Klein-Peshova, and I will be moderating the question and answer portion of our program. It is an honor to be here and to take part in this important conversation. Hi, Sam and Noga. How are you? Thank you for sharing your story with us today. We really appreciate that. And thank you for agreeing to answer questions from the audience. I'm talking to you now from my office on Purdue's campus. It's a bit rainy and a bit cloudy today, so good weather for thinking and reflecting. Today is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. That is why we plan to have this discussion with you now. I wonder if we might begin our conversation with some of your thoughts on Yom HaShoah. Is there anything in particular that you do on Yom HaShoah?
Mostly watch other people's stories on TV. It's not very encouraging. That's my point of view. I'll pass on the right of speech to my wife in a little while. I think that the lessons of the Shoah haven't been fully learned yet. And I think that it's the duty of the educational system to set up a framework, to set up clear objectives on what we want to teach future generations in order to avoid a repetition of such a tragedy. You want to add anything?
As I was born in Israel, since every year I take this day not as usual. Every time we hear another story, and still we can't imagine that it was real, but I know it was real. We light a candle. I will go and I will show you the candle that we light every Yom HaShoah. It's a custom in Israel that when somebody is died, you light a candle. Here we have for Yom HaShoah, I hope you see it, and I put two candles. It's one from the name after the name of the mother of Shmuel, and the other is his father. But usually in every family, you have people that you lost in the Shoah. It's a day that you have to think of the life, to think of the behave, and to hate war.
Thank you for this. I'm thinking that this relates very much to several questions that we have in the box that ask us how we can educate better to fight against anti-Semitism today, and how we can best reflect on the Holocaust, in your view.
That's a question for an educator. I'm not an educator, although I taught for 6 years. I was a teacher for 6 years. 3 years I was a grade school teacher, and for 3 additional years I was a technical school teacher. But I haven't thought and I haven't made a program on how to teach about the Holocaust. But everything that's offered today shows you what happened, talks about the past. I don't see any program facing the future, telling us what we should teach the next generations, what are the conclusions, how can we accept minorities, how we can respect other people's view, and how we can see people just as human beings and put aside their political or religious views. They are not important. What's important is that we are all human beings.
Yeah.
And it's our right to develop, to found the family, and to grow, and not to persecute other people.
Well, you mentioned there that the most important thing is to be a human being and treat others with the respect and dignity that belongs to being human beings, and that the religion itself is less important than that. So that brings me to another question that's here in the list, about your connection to Judaism. In what way are you connected to Judaism? How have your experiences affected your connection to Judaism or Jewish practice, your relationship to the Jewish community?
I'm a secular Jew. I'm non-observant. I think that Judaism is not only religion, but Judaism has additional messages for mankind, starting as early as 2,000 years ago with the 10 Commandments. And what can I say? I respect people that think otherwise, but I tell you what, a chief rabbi in Israel was a concentration camp survivor. And I still can't understand it. I lost my faith. And I think that our duty is to use our personal resources to make this place a place where we can enjoy life. And I don't expect any outside help from yonder. If there is going to be help, it should come from my fellow people, human beings.
Thank you. I'm also thinking now of other questions that relate to how your experiences have affected how you raise your children. So how do you bring in your experiences to the way that you've brought up your children, your wishes for their childhood and their growing up?
Well, I'm very proud of my children, and I try not to make any difference between my own children and my acquired children. And what I'm trying to transmit, what I try to, they are grown up now, so there's nothing else I can do about it. But what I've tried all the time is to make them be tolerant and look at the positive side of life, what life has to offer, and try to enjoy as much as possible.
Yeah, I know your kids give you a lot of nachas.
Right. And at the same time, they are very constructive, very positive.
Thinking about kids and childhood, I wonder if we might think a little bit about your younger years, and you can say what you're willing to answer and not willing to answer. But there are some questions here wondering if you ever went back to the village where you were born, if you remember any of your relations with your neighbors growing up. I know that you were quite young at that time, but is there anything that you remember that you can put your finger on from the childhood years?
Well, I'll make a statement that probably many people won't like, but I think that I'm blessed. I'm blessed that I erased most of my childhood experiences. I don't remember anything. As going back to visit, there was something I didn't explain in my presentation, but maybe some people noticed that there were some pictures, family pictures, and maybe people asked, where do these pictures come from? The story is that my aunt, Bronya, who raised me, he left a box with pictures at her home. And that was close to the roof. After the war, when the war ended and we came back to Zalesczyki, our hometown, so-called hometown, she went to what used to be her home, and where now a family of Ukrainians live. And when she said who she was, when she introduced herself, they slammed the door in her face. Probably they didn't like the thought that she came to claim her home. So since we were very close with Lucia, that I met in Israel, I mentioned her. Lucia at that time was in her 20s, and she was going out with an officer in the Red Army. So Bronya told her what happened, and Lucia went with her boyfriend, the officer, knocked at that door, and they wouldn't dare refuse entrance to a Russian officer. So that's how we got those old photographs, family photographs. There is a relative from us living in Canada. Her name is Mila Messner. Mila
is the cousin of your mother.
Is the cousin of my mother, and she set up as an objective to set up a remembrance for the fallen Jews, the killed Jews, in the square of the town. So she made a collection, and it's in YouTube. And they set up a remembrance monument in the old Jewish cemetery of Zalesczyki, which is now a soccer playground. So the cemetery doesn't exist. No Jews lives in Zalesczyki. There's nothing I can look for in there. So there's no point for me going back there. And probably if I start speaking with people, I think that I might get very upset. So I'd rather not go there.
When Shmuel met me, that was the time that he met also Lucia. He didn't know nothing about Lucia. I found her in Israel. And she, as she was from the city, Zalesczyki, and she was with him and his aunt Bronya and his mother at the beginning, all the way from the city until the ghetto and the camp. She told us all the history about Shmuel. She was very close. The mother of Shmuel was a teacher, and she was her teacher, and she loved her very much. This is the reason she loved the child, and she was very close to Shmuel. She told us all the story, and she gave us the book Tlosta that tell what happened in that place that he was born. As Shmuel said that he does not remember anything, but when we are sitting in the evening and we are talking, suddenly something came. When I touch his leg, when I start being with him, suddenly he said, it's the same like my grandmother did. It came from him, from out of the blue. And once we were in the field with strawberry, shooting with strawberry. And he said, oh, I remember that we have a garden next the house. with strawberry, and I was hiding there. And
I was 4 years old at that time.
And another thing I remember, that he was alone in the camp, the only child in the camp. And we saw the movie, The Beautiful Days, Italian movie, הימים היפים. And there was a child looking from the bed inside the tzrif, how do you say?
Barracks.
Suddenly he said, oh, it was the same that I was hiding there. It means that he doesn't remember, but something coming when the situation is the same. It's in his mind back. But he was a child.
Yeah.
The best is that he does not remember the moment that they kill his mother in his face.
Thank you for that. Remembrances. I have a few questions here that ask you about your sense of belonging. Some are related to the idea of immigration and to home and to language. And I'd like to start with the question of language. So you speak a number of languages now. And
Yes.
With which language do you feel most comfortable and why?
I feel most comfortable with Spanish, of course, because I got my education in Spanish. English was an acquired language. I had English in high school, but that was basic English. And then I started working for an American company. So I had to work in English. So I think that I'm more or less fluent in English. Acceptable, let's put it this way. I used to speak fluent Yiddish, but since Branya passed away, I didn't speak it, I didn't use it anymore. So that was a problem. I forgot Polish totally. I normally, all I remember are dirty words. Those are the last to forget.
The last to go.
Yes. And so that takes care of Polish, that takes care for Yiddish. And now, well, I don't know if I'm taking much of your time, but there is a story about Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
I learned Hebrew in the Jewish teacher's seminar, but that was biblical Hebrew. And I remember when we came to Israel, 1991, the Jewish agency put a taxi cab at our disposition to take us to our lodging.
Mm.
And I started talking with the driver in my Hebrew, and I look at the driver, and the driver starts laughing. And I was wondering, why are you laughing? I haven't heard this kind of Hebrew since school. So then, of course, I bought a cassette course. In those times, we used cassettes. of spoken Hebrew so I could get around and I could meet my present wife, of course.
When I met him, he spoke very well Hebrew.
Thank you. We have time for one more question here, and I would like to ask you about emigration. We had a question early on if you ever
hold it. How am I doing so far?
Great. Perfect time.
Okay. I needed to know that.
Okay. So we're in for the home stretch now, and I'm going to ask if you ever considered emigrating to the U.S.
Well, you are putting me in a tough spot.
If you don't want to answer, you don't have to. We can move.
I have to answer because I believe in being frank, so I must answer. And you being American, I don't want to hurt your feelings. And the story goes like this. I was manager of field engineering in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and my boss was in Schenectady, upstate New York. And I took my orders from him. And at that time, my wife passed away, and we already decided to emigrate to Israel. So my boss said, business is very low, you have to travel. So besides being a manager, you also have to be a field engineer. So I said, okay, but I need 2 years for my son to finish high school, and at that time, I would like to stay permanently in office so I can attend to their needs and I can start paperwork for my immigration. And he said, I can't let you do that. I need you to travel. So I said, well, so you don't leave me any option other than to resign. And I did. So I resigned, and I had a friend, and he had dealings with a company that did repairs of gas turbines in the States, in Jacksonville, Florida. So I asked them, I wrote them and I asked them if I can get a job with them. And I sent my resume. And they hired me, and I started working for them. And I spent almost a year in the States, and I felt that the society in the States is kind of close. For me, it was very difficult to befriend people. So that's why I put the option of the US aside and decided for Israel. Another reason was that I've been in Europe. I felt myself strange in Europe, a visitor. I grew up in Argentina, and I didn't feel that I belonged in Argentina. And all my life I dreamed of going to Israel. And since I've been in Israel, I felt that this is the place where I belong to. So I found my resting place. Let's put it this way.
Thank you. I'm glad.
I don't know if this answers your question.
It does. It does. I'm glad you are at home. Well, we've had about a full half an hour now of conversation, and I'm going to wrap it up now with many thanks to Sam and Noga for talking with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions that are in the box. I tried to collate them and ask some of the more frequent questions. And if you could see this box right now, you'd see all of the thank yous in it and all the appreciation for you in sharing your story. So thank you again for that. It means a great deal to all of us here, students, educators, and members of the community, and me and everyone, your children, for participating in this conversation. I will now turn the floor back over to Sarah Powley. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam and Noga. Thank you, Rebecca.
Everybody.
Thank you. I want to thank Sam and Noga and Rebecca for that inspiring dialogue. We loved your story, Sam. And we feel the same. We feel like your message of unity and dignity for all people is our message too. So thank you. And thank you for sharing a story about, I think, the resilience of the human heart. And it's a good message for this day.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Noga.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this special discussion with Juan Wachs, the youngest son of Sam Wachs, with whom we spoke last week and whose presentation you just saw, at this year's 40th Annual Greater Lafayette Holocaust Remembrance Conference. My name is Rebecca Klein-Peshova, and I will be moderating the live question and answer portion of our program. It is an honor to be here and to take part in this important conversation. Now, before we begin, I want to take a moment to remember that our conversation this evening is with Juan, Sam Wachs' youngest son. We've reached a point in our history quite far from the events of the Second World War, 76 years ago. We're in a period of transition in which very few survivors are still alive and able to discuss their experiences. Therefore, we have begun to think much more about the experiences of the second generation, the children of survivors. This is the context for our discussion with Juan this evening. Hi, Juan.
Hello, how are you?
It's good to see you. Well, I'm talking to you from my office. It looks like you're right here on campus, but I guess this is a background. So I'd like to begin by asking you a question I have here as I'm gathering more questions coming in. And this question is about your first memory of your father's story. What is your first memory of hearing about your father's story?
Well, I was very young. I couldn't understand the issue of the topic of the Nazis. Came up frequently in all kind of conversations. And you know, when you're a kid, you are busy playing and busy doing your things, and you only later put together the pieces and you start understanding what was going on. I could go to my grandmother, which again wasn't my grandmother, was my dad's aunt that adopted me. We call her grandmother. She acted as a mother for my dad, for everything, right? So just to give you a few examples, she would have a picture of her own son that was killed by the Nazis. And he resembled a lot my dad. And every time I would look at that, and the most natural thing that you would ask your grandmother when you see a picture of someone that looks in the 20s is this dad, right? This is how he looked. And, she would say, no, that's my son. That was very confusing to me, who is her son? I couldn't understand exactly. I mean, she was my grandmother. Or, kids like guns. I would ask my grandmother to buy me toys, to buy me a gun and, these machine guns, these toys. She would not want to buy anything related to war or even talk about that. When I started growing up, I was already 13, 14. I would ask her, what do you remember about the war? Why that happened? Why you didn't escape? What do you think that's going to happen? Why you didn't emigrate? She would change the subject. She would not say a word about the war. That was a taboo topic. And I have to say that even my dad he barely talked about the Holocaust. For one, because he was too young, and two, because really it was too strong. And it seems that he only was able to revisit this several years later from a different position, a different place, from Israel. He was able to go back and talk about that. Just adding more to answer your question. I remember one scene, we were at dinner, and I did something, I don't remember what I did in the elementary school. I did something bad, like what kids do. And a friend of mine told me, when your parents are going to scold you for that, tell them, the answer is, what, you never had a childhood? What, you didn't do things like that? You never had a childhood? So, of course, I was at home. I did something at the elementary school. And, of course, my father called me and he said, well, what happened? You didn't have childhood? And then he replied right away, no, I didn't have childhood. I was in the Holocaust. For which, I didn't have an answer to that. I couldn't understand. Or my dad or my mom oftentimes intervening in discussions and saying, you need to understand that because he is sick. He passed the Holocaust. And if you pass war, you are sick. It makes you sick. It's going to make you, there are consequences. There are sequels from the war. So he's ill from the war.
Thank you for that detailed answer. And as we're going through and talking, if there's anything that you don't want to talk about that someone has asked, you can just say, you'd rather not talk about that. I have another question here that asked about when you were little, when you were a little kid, what did your father tell you about why you don't have a grandmother or grandfather on your father's side? How did he explain missing relatives to you?
He would say that they died in the Holocaust. The story that I remember is that his grandfather, his father, died in the gas chamber. Again, if you look at the book that he showed, those things are not clearly explained. So you never know exactly how he knew or how he was told that his mom was also killed. He didn't say that. Of course, he didn't talk about the circumstances of how things happened. He actually doesn't remember seeing his mom being killed. He was told what happened, but he was there, so probably he saw what happened. He was very honest about that. Again, as a child, didn't understand exactly what Nazis are. Clearly, it was something very bad, because if they can kill, so many people in your family and so many other families, it was clear that it was something very bad. But you learn from movies, from war movies, how Nazis look like, and this is what you understand as a kid.
I have a question here from an audience member named Jarrett Huber, who asks about your experiences in this way, your father's experiences. I find it amazing that your father lived through the Holocaust and then under the Argentine dictatorship. Has he ever offered to you his perspective on human nature or evil, or on how living through regimes like this altered his world perspective?
Well, I don't think that we understand the human nature and evil. I think that the Holocaust taught every one of us that, you can have a society that is instructed, that is educated, that is leading culturally and intellectually the world, and yet you can have the Holocaust. So it seems that, it's not about intellectual progress. There has to be some ethical compass that guide us. And I guess that what he tried to do is to raise me with education, with values of equality, and that we are all human beings. We are all human beings. Doesn't matter your religion or your race or your background. And you need always to respect the other person, to try to understand the other person. Be always respectful for the other, and never do to the other person what you wouldn't want to get done or to be done to you. I guess that in those forms of teachings, this is how he conveyed his understanding of moral.
Related to this, you mentioned this idea of having an ethical compass. And so it makes me think of several questions that have come up here about religiosity. If your father is religious, if you're religious, what is your relationship to religious practice or religious community? Those can be two different things.
My dad is a secular Jew. Means he doesn't believe in God. He's Jewish. He's proud of being Jewish. He loves the Jewish culture and the history and values, of course. But and he is very well aware of religion because he studied that. In fact, as a kid, he studied in Argentina in a religious school. So he's very knowledgeable about religion. But he particularly do not believe in God. And my grandmother, it seems that she believed at some extent because she was, she was mad at it. She said that God doesn't exist. If she can let go, she can let something like the Holocaust happen. So if that happens, that's a proof that God doesn't exist. So, after the tragedies that she went through, she couldn't believe anymore in anything like that. I myself, I'm secular as well. I'm Jewish, but secular. My mother was very secular. She was very proud Argentinian. She wouldn't want to move to Israel or emigrate or leave Argentina. So, I was raised with those, two currents of education. One that puts a lot of emphasis in Judaism, and the other current that puts a lot of emphasis on humanism and equality. Yep.
Yeah. So you've mentioned that your mother wasn't interested in moving to Israel, and that it's a decision that you and your dad and your other brother made later. What was it like? How did you feel about moving from Argentina to Israel? What about leaving your friends just after finishing high school? About the adjustment. You came at a time when a lot of people were moving to Israel. This 91, there were all these Jews coming from the former Soviet Union. But what kind of experience was that?
Well, on one end, Israel and the Israelis and the Middle East is a culture that is completely different from anything that we know from, Western society. It's a totally different idiosyncrasy and culture. Yes, I knew some Hebrew. Yes, I knew Jewish history and tradition. Those things, I guess, help at some extent. But the culture is very, very different. And, Israel is a small country. It's a tiny country. Even compared to Argentina, Israel is smaller than the smallest province in Argentina. Imagine that. And Mediterranean people are warm people. So not only that the country is small, but also the character of the people is very welcoming and warm, which is something that you see a lot in the Middle East in general. So we didn't really we didn't feel like strangers. Of course, in the beginning, you need to adapt yourself to it. It's a very difficult, very different culture, and that's at times difficult as well. But the society as a whole, I think that made our stay, very, very, enjoyable, and they were very welcoming. And it's a society that is continuously receiving new immigrants. So that is really the status quo, is continuously adapting to change and realizing that, what is the Israeli? They call it Saba. Saba is the person that, the same way that a Husher is someone native from Indiana. So the Tsabar is the native from Israel. What is it, Tsabar? Well, how you can have someone that is native is if all the time you're getting new people are immigrating into the country, and the country and the society are changing based on what people are bringing. So it's very dynamic.
Yeah, and do you find, there's another question here, speaking about the culture of Israel, do you find that there are any influences from your father's upbringing or from Aunt Bronia that made it into your childhood and adulthood in Israel, that you felt this transfer move over to this very different kind of culture?
Well, in the end of the day, you're the same person that moves between places. You don't change that. You change certain things, but in terms of your personality and your values, those things follow you in a way. It's part of your personality. I have to say that the Jewish community in Argentina, the same way that the Jewish community in the United States, has its own culture in a way, and tradition, if you want. And when you contrast that with what you find in Israel, you even see that among Jews, there is a lot of differences. You look at the Sephardic Jews, you look at the Jews, from, Iraq and Iran, and then you see the Ashkenazis, the one coming from Russia. They're all Jews, and the Jews coming from Ethiopia. And they're all Jews, but they're all coming with such a different background that, there are things in common. There's so many things different as well. So, So whatever we learn and we experience in Argentina, I would say was very different of what we saw in Israel.
Yeah. But when you were growing up in Argentina and in Israel, did you did you have friends or acquaintances who had similar experiences, who were also children of survivors?
Yeah, I saw that it's a good question. A lot of friends of mine had relatives that, you know, they lost people, they lost relatives that perished in the Holocaust. However, I didn't have any friend of mine that their close relatives passed in the Holocaust. In a way, I mean, the Jewish community in Argentina are all the people that succeed escaping right before the Holocaust started. They saw what was happening and succeed somehow moving away and escaping. The ones that, you know, the people that didn't move at that point, a fraction of 1% maybe are the ones that survived. They were basically doomed to die. Very few survived. So back then it was extremely difficult to really find survivors. Imagine today they're, you know, even more difficult to find people that survived the Holocaust, right? That they can tell the story.
Yeah, you know, there are a lot of questions here about anti-Semitism today and what you see around you. Have you taken any thoughts of your father, or warnings from your father about what you see around you today? The rise of far-right groups around the world, this new rising anti-Semitism. So there are a number of people asking how you react to that. How do you respond to that? And you can answer or not answer however you like to this question.
Well, it's painful. And I think that it's especially painful when you see that it's close to home. I have seen 2 years ago, I think it was, maybe even last year, in a very few times, I mean, you know, counted times, very few times, in campus at Purdue, posters, you know, hanging there denying the fact that the Holocaust occurred. And I'm really tempted to go to these people. First of all, there are no names there. There is no signatures. You know, these people are cowards. They don't tell you who they are. But I would like to go and say, you know, don't tell me that this didn't happen because I lost a big part of my family there. I know exactly. They didn't disappear from one day to the other. And it's painful to see that, or to see white supremacy, or to see expressions of racism in any form, you know, in stickers and posters in campus. I have to say, luckily at Purdue, I didn't see many of that. There were very, very few times that I saw that, maybe 3 or 4 times. I'm aware that in other places in the United States, that's more common. It's painful, it's sad, and I think that nationalism is not the answer. I thought that Israel would stand for equal rights of any kind, right? I have to say that I am disappointed by the government, the previous government in the United States, the current government in Israel, about, you know, favoring nationalism to making sure that the rights of minorities are respected.
Thank you.
And this is a trend that you see in many other countries, almost all around the world.
It's a tough one. And I wonder if you have any suggestions. What do you see as a good way forward from here, as a way to preserve and maintain democracy and to make a better environment for protection of minorities?
Yes, I would, basically repeat what my dad said. I mean, again, I cannot give. I am as good as you are here. I really. I mean, you could have asked me when I came to United States 10 years ago, a little bit more, 12 years ago, if I could see, white supremacists in the streets demonstrating or, be responsible of murder or things that are pretty terrible. If I would see that in a place like the United States, I wouldn't think, I knew that happened, but I wouldn't think that I would see that close to home. And it happened. I'm shocked about that. I'm sad. I think that all of you are, most of you are, of course. And I don't have any insight. Rebecca, you are the scholar in human rights and history. You probably have better insights than me. Yeah, I even, talked to my dad about his presentation. I look at the last slide about democracy. I said, Dad, remember that Hitler actually came to the government, to the president in democratic elections. So if democracy is the most important value, what is the hope here? Is that the answer? It seems that it's not the answer. It's not enough, right? So yeah, I don't have an answer.
Okay. Let's move from that dark place to another topic. Thinking about language, as you are a polyglot, right? And we want to think about how you use language. In which language do you feel most comfortable?
Well, I feel more comfortable in Spanish. It's my mother tongue. There is a beautiful song, a Hebrew song in Israel, because of the immigration, the large amount of immigration, that talks about how beautiful the Hebrew language is, because it has this and has that and has different ways to express your feelings. And he talks about how much he's in love with Hebrew, but then he says, but at night, deep at night, I still dream in Spanish. And I think that is the same with me, we speak at home in Spanish, but of course, all around we speak English, right? I speak Hebrew when I talk to my family in Israel very often. But in the end of the day, I guess that I still think in Spanish.
Yeah, the native language. Mm-hmm. And as a follow-up to that, I would ask you where you feel most at home. And this was a topic that came up a lot in talking with your father. Yes,
I think that I start feeling like the story of the ever wandering Jew. They say that the Jews don't have a home; they always will wander around. I think that Israel was actually created with hope that the Jew will find it, and I think that to some extent that is true. But after being in so many places, I think that home is something that you carry with you in your heart, and is less a physical place. And of course, the physical place plays a role, and the people that you know, and the language, right, and the culture. But when you have your own family and your kids, that the home is where they are. You actually feel at home when you are with them, and that's regardless of the place. So now we are here in the United States, so this is home, right? And this is where I have my family.
Right. home is where the family is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and okay, so I have a question about that too. How do you talk about your father's experiences to your children? And how did you introduce your father's experiences to Liz, your wife?
Well, children is more difficult in a way because they don't see their grandpa very often, and definitely not now with COVID. And traveling to Israel is quite expensive, so we cannot do that every year or every 2 years. I do travel. I try to travel once a year. But with the kids, we cannot do that very often. So there is Skype, there is Zoom, right? And they can see each other. But unfortunately, the distance, has an effect on the relationship and of course on their interest on finding out about the roots and the history of their grandfather. And I'm sure that as they will grow, they will start asking more and more questions, right? But kids are kids, and they are interested in certain things, and you try to answer whatever they ask you. And there are things that they are not concerned too much now.
We'll see how it goes as they get older.
Yes.
They have more questions about this. So as we're wrapping up here, in addition, I want to let you know that in the Q&A box and in the chat where people are writing in, there's a lot of appreciation for you and for sharing your answers tonight. So I want to let you know that. And to wrap up, I want to ask you if there's any kind of final thought that you want to pass at this point to leave the people with who are here listening.
And by the way, last but not least, I just want to say that if there is any question that remain unanswered, or you guys want to chat with me about this, or with my dad, feel free to share my email. It's Juan.Wachs, WACHS, @gmail.com. It's my first name, last name, @gmail.com. Feel free to contact me and ask or to ask if you have a question to my dad. Probably, I can also make the connection. I'm very thankful that you guys organized this event, especially now, Remembrance Day. I think that this is one of the few ways that we can actually make sure that things like this don't happen again. It's by remembering, by telling the story. The more time, in another 5, 10, 20 years, there's not going to be anyone that can tell the story firsthand about the Holocaust. All of the people who have passed. So all these people that are actually saying, no, the Holocaust never happened. Well, who will be there to say otherwise? Who will be there to say, no, I was there, I saw that with my own eyes? No one. So the best that we can do is to try to keep their memory and their stories through events like this, to try to fight back those forces that try to, erase that dark part of the history. And know that there is no guarantees for anyone that things like this will not happen again. We want to think, and you ask me how, with my wife, how I introduced my dad, how I told him the story of the Holocaust. I remember when we started dating, she would say, well, something like that would never happen in the United States. I think that after experiencing and getting to know me and getting to know more about my history and the history of the Jewish people, and by looking at what is going on in the recent years in the United States, well, not in the recent years, this has been going for a long time, but I think that we have seen this emerging again, especially during the last several years. And, she started questioning whether things like this can happen again or not. And I think that the conclusion is that there is no way to guarantee that things like this will not happen.
Yeah.
And there is the role, we are responsible, each of us, to make sure that the rights of minorities are protected and the history is not erased, that, we keep memory about things that happen. We may forgive, but we shouldn't forget.
I think that's a good place to wrap up here. Thank you so much, Juan. It's been great. We've talked about a lot of things over the years as we haven't had this conversation. It's been nice to talk with you in this way. And it means a great deal to all of us here, the students, educators, members of the community, the planning committee, to me also. And I thank you for questions and for being here, everybody. I'm sorry for questions I didn't get to. And I'm now going to turn the floor back over to Sarah Powley. But before I do, please allow me to extend special thanks to her for her tireless efforts in bringing this event and all the events into being. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Juan, so very much. We appreciate all the wisdom that you've imparted this evening and appreciate the inspiring words that you've had to say about home and family and the importance of keeping the memory of what happened during the Holocaust alive. And that is our mission too. So I want to thank the audience for joining us and the sponsors and the individual donors again who made this program possible. And I want to thank the committee members, especially all of the committee members worked on this in so many ways, but I especially want to thank Joe Sykos and Eyal Barash and Amber Nickel for their work behind the scenes. So with that, thank you all, and thank you for attending the 40th Annual Greater Lafayette Holocaust Remembrance Conference.